Welcome to Wicked Wednesdays, folks. A day for any form of horror imaginable. True stories, old-timey ghost stories, creepypasta, and classic horror shorts. Gather round and settle in, for tonight, I, Phantasmal Poppy, bring you an extra spooky creepypasta about amusement parks, and how some experiences at them aren't always so amusing. Now, I give you why I stopped going to the county fair. I used to love going to the county fair. About a month after school started back, our town would host it. All the neighboring towns would pitch in and hire people to set up an amusement park out in this big field. The company would level out the dirt for the racetrack and auction barn, fix up the booths from the previous year, and set up concession stands and portable toilets as necessary. In years past, it was one of the few yearly gatherings that brought people out of the woodwork to socialize, but now it was mostly a way to give the kids, and their teachers and parents, a breather from the stress of getting into the swing of the new school year. The last year I went, I volunteered to drive because I was the only one with a car. Initially, there were only supposed to be 3 of us, but my friend Amy got stuck bringing her little brothers with us. With us being a bunch of teenage girls finally getting away from our parents, none of us were happy that we had a couple of nosy 8-year-old rattletraps tagging along. I could tell that Amy was especially displeased because she had been having a very stressful week, and I could tell she really just wanted to get away from home for a little bit. Cell phones weren't a thing at the time, so whatever was on her mind would have to wait until we were out of earshot of the boys. Considering how quietly she was stewing in the back seat, whatever it was likely wasn't meant for their young ears. I figured we could probably send the kids off to play on their own. Of course, shaking the 2 brats wound up being harder than I thought. As it turned out, the company running the fairgrounds that year had started implementing stricter policies about children going off on their own. I think there was some accident at one of their sister locations, because now there were stricter height, weight, and other health standards, and children very close to the cutoff point had to be accompanied by an adult on any ride they went on. Guess who was tap dancing all over that line? We tried to direct the boys to look at some of the booths or play some of the games first in order to give Amy time to open up, but they weren't very interested in the displays and didn't have a lot of money for the tokens, so that didn't work. Amy begrudgingly went with the boys on a few rides, but that seemed to hype them up more than satisfy them. Just when Amy looked like she was about to burst into tears from failing to get a moment to herself, her savior came in the form of one of our other friends, a girl named Jessie. Jessie was that one girl who always felt like she had something to prove to the world. If it was a dare, she'd do it. She had to be known for being the best in some way at something. If she couldn't be the fastest, she'd be the strongest. If she couldn't be the strongest, she'd be the most enduring. That girl turned everything into a challenge, but she put a positive spin on things in a way that her A-type personality didn't come across as too competitive and overbearing. So right when Amy looked like she was about to explode from having a kid talking on each hand, Jessie stepped in and offered to watch the boys for a bit, including going on as many rides as they wanted. The boys were ecstatic. Heaving a sigh of relief, Amy gratefully turned guardianship of her brothers over to our friend, and they headed off to some swinging dragon boat ride. Finally, I was able to get Amy away from everything so she could just spill the beans about what was going on. We snuck off and plopped down behind the auction barn, planting our backs against the weathered wooden slabs of the wall where it was cooler. The little reprieve from the chaos and the sticky humidity in the air opened the floodgates, and Amy just sobbed quietly into her hands for a while, unable to hold herself together any longer. When she had calmed down, I went to grab her a water so she wouldn't wind up with a headache from all that crying. As I did, I decided to check in with Jessie and make sure she was still in one piece. She was drenched in sweat and beet red from running about the muggy fairgrounds, and she was sort of holding her stomach a little, but otherwise seemed fine. The boys were having a blast and soon pulled her away to try some other rides. Satisfied we still had a little time, I quickly paid for a couple of waters and headed back to Amy. And that's how the rest of the afternoon went. Amy vented to me about how tensions between her parents had been increasing at home, putting more and more of her brother's care onto her shoulders. Her classes were harder than ever, and she was scared of her grades dropping and getting into trouble at home. In addition, she had a boyfriend who had been pressuring her to be more physical with him, and while she wasn't entirely opposed to it, she knew her parents would lose their minds if they found out. After Amy had poured her heart out for about an hour, I realized we hadn't heard from Jesse or the boys, so I went to check on them while Amy caught her breath. It took about 5 minutes of walking around, but I finally spotted one of the boys sitting on a bench. "Where's your brother and Jesse?" I asked him. He finished sucking up the dregs of his lemonade and thumbed toward the ride behind him. Just then, I spotted his brother bounding out of what looked to be a giant tuna can, with Jesse sort of shambling down behind him. The kid was beaming and started telling his brother about how the machine spun them around until the platforms they were strapped to on the walls would slide up to the ceiling and back as the ride tilted around. I looked over at Jessie, who was forcing a smile while she held her stomach. She wasn't nearly as red in the face anymore and was starting to look pale. "Are you all right?" I asked her. She nodded shakily. Yeah, I'm good." Her breath hitched like she was going to hurl, but let out a shaky breath instead. "I'm fine." "You sure about that?" I said. She didn't look all right. Knowing Amy's brothers, they probably had her running on rides from the time we split up. I looked over at them, but they seemed fine. "Don't worry, I've been making sure they've kept hydrated and been pacing themselves." I quirked my eyebrow at her. "But what about you?" She just weakly waved an arm at me and asked how Amy was. I told her she was starting to get to the heart of things, but it sounded like she hadn't had a breather in weeks. Frowning, Jessie nodded. "She told me at lunch yesterday. Amy's got a lot on her plate right now. She could use all the time to herself that she can get." I looked at her. Her words were slurring a bit, and she seemed to be getting paler by the second. I noticed her eyes seemed a little darker than usual. "Are you sure you're all right?" I asked her again. Jessie nodded just in time for the second boy to get up and begin gesturing toward the ride. "Don't worry about me. I can rest in line." Before she could say more, she had turned and was following the next kid over to the entrance. I noticed as I was leaving that, as late as it was, there wasn't much of a line left, so Jessie had righted herself the best she could and was headed back into the ride without a moment's reprieve. By the time I found Amy again, she had dozed off, so I didn't disturb her. Instead, I went around and grabbed us a few snacks for when she woke up. The stress had kept her in an almost insomniac state for nearly a week, so it wasn't any wonder why she had broken down that evening. The crying must have drained her, because she managed to sit through me crunching through an entire bag of chips. I guess the excitement of the day had gotten to me too, because it wasn't long before I found my own eyelids starting to droop. I awoke to my watch beeping. I had set an alarm that would have given us plenty of time to get home before my curfew, and the electronic noise was enough to stir me. I realized I had slumped over onto Amy's shoulder and sat up, rubbing my cheek where I was sure there was now a huge red spot. Amy started stirring a moment later. Yawning, she asked me what time it was. I told her and we got up, looking around at the much darker, much quieter fairgrounds. I wondered if Jessie had found us and just let us rest. Since we had been out for another hour and a half, Surely the kids would have had their fill of rides by now. Sure enough, we found them sitting at one of the picnic tables, with nearly empty fountain drinks and empty paper food containers in front of them. They looked tired and were a lot less energetic than when I had seen them last. "Hey guys," I said as we approached. "Where's Jesse?" One of the boys, who was still chewing on the remnants of a corn dog, pointed over to the table beside him. I walked over and saw Jessie stretched out on the bench, an arm pressed over her eyes and one hand gripping at the fabric of her shirt. Upon closer inspection, I saw her teeth were gritted tightly, and she looked to be in a lot of pain. I glared at the boys. "Just how many rides did you take her on?" I didn't wait for a response as I crouched down next to her. "Jessie? You okay?" She barely shook her head, and I saw a shimmer of sweat gleam around the skin where her arm met her eyes. I caught a strong whiff of bile and knew she had definitely been sick. She must have really overdid it to buy us some time. Amy started to lecture the boys about wearing out our friend, and they actually seemed caught between concern and confusion. She'd barely made it out of the umpteenth ride in the flying tin can and practically threw herself at the trash can the moment she made it out. She did the same to 2 more unfortunate bins until she was able to make her way over to the picnic tables. After giving the boys enough money to get themselves something to eat and her a drink, she had disappeared into the bathroom long enough for them to almost finish eating, before finally coming out and sprawling across the nearest empty seat in agony. I got extreme motion sickness on rides when I was little, so I felt sorry for her. Still, we'd been to this fair for 3 years, and I never had seen her get so sick. Of course, since this was the last day of the fair, the lines had been a lot smaller, and Jessie had never spent so long on the rides as she had had that day, nor rode them back to back in such rapid succession. Getting her down to the car was a chore in itself. She didn't want to move, and when she finally attempted it, I could see that the sweat under her arm wasn't sweat, but tears. It wasn't like her to cry from anything, so when I saw that, I started to get worried. Her eyes looked strange, too, with one pupil open fully, and the other less but still very wide. She had to stop once along the way to hit the nearest trash can and practically flung herself into it. She brought up far more than what I thought someone could have in their system and asked the boys if she'd eaten or drank anything. But she hadn't. She hadn't even touched the water she had sent them for. In the end, Amy and I looped her arms over our shoulders and half carried her to my car. All the while, she heaved as if she might throw up again, and despite it being so hot and humid, she shivered as if she was in the dead of winter. Amy pulled some tissues out of her purse to give to her, and Jessie practically fell into the car with the wadded papers pressed against her lips. I helped buckle her in, and she panted heavily, trying to keep her stomach still, and we took off. The whole ride to Jessie's, the boys, who were sitting next to her, were leaning as far away as they could in case she got sick again. Eventually, we pulled into our driveway and got out. Her dad still wasn't home, so we had the Herculean task of getting her out of the car and into the house before we could leave. We laid her on the couch and put the kitchen garbage pail and a bottle of water nearby before we headed out. By the time all was said and done, I had everyone dropped off and made it back in the door of my own parents' house before my curfew kicked in. After I got settled in that evening, I tried calling Jessie to check on her, but there was no answer. I figured she had probably decided to sleep off the motion sickness, so I would just have to see her at school, and I got ready for bed. It was a few hours later when my mother shook me awake, hitting me with a barrage of questions that didn't make any sense. Jessie's dad was on the phone and was asking in a frantic voice if Jessie had eaten anything at the fair. She even asked me if she had been doing drugs, which made me wonder if I was still asleep. Jessie? Do drugs? That girl may have made everything into a challenge, but she wasn't stupid. She couldn't even stand the smell of cigarettes, let alone pot or anything else. I told her no and asked her why. She relayed the information over the phone and began asking me if I had seen anything suspicious. I told her no, and that she had just been riding rides all evening with Amy's brothers so Amy could take a break from babysitting them. My mother repeated what I said, and I heard a very angry, very panicked man's voice crackle through the phone's receiver, and what sounded like a howl of agony and a lot of words that were too indistinct to understand. When the phone call was over, my mother came back into the room and told me to get dressed. Jesse's dad had come home and found his daughter sprawled out on the floor, with splotches of sticky dark green bile mixed with bright red blood, leading a trail from the couch to the phone where she had called him before she had collapsed. We didn't learn until a few hours after we got to the hospital what had really happened. Somehow, due to a condition that she didn't even know she had, something inside of Jesse's gastrointestinal tract had perforated. It had pretty much been a ticking time bomb, and all of the constant negative G-force from that final ride had been enough to cause the full rupture. What I had written off as a bad case of motion sickness was something very, very lethal. I stood there in the hospital hallway. I felt as though the very air, the very sound around me had been sucked out of reality. I could see her dad panicking, Amy crying, Amy's dad with a stony look on his face, looking between his wife and his eldest child. But I couldn't hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears and my own heartbeat. That night became the one challenge that Jesse would never again attempt. That's why I don't go to the county fair anymore. No one else will go with me. I guess the one good thing that came out of this is that Amy's parents finally worked out whatever they were going through. I guess they saw how much Amy blamed herself over Jesse getting hurt when she shouldn't have been put in that position to start. And Jessie, like the fighter she is, she turned getting better into a challenge, but she's been turned off the idea of amusement parks for a very long time to come. I suppose the health restrictions they post on those rides make sense to me now, even though I know I won't be going back to need them anytime soon. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this story. This creepypasta was actually inspired by something that happened to me back in high school. I had gone to a local fair with some of my friends, and we ran across a classmate of ours and her little brother. Since it was pretty obvious she needed a vent to one of my friends, I wound up playing babysitter so they could talk. Wound up going on the graviton 6 times in succession because there was pretty much no lines and this little boy was a pure sadist. By the time I came out, it felt like my stomach was trying to squish out through my spine. Nothing got ruptured, mind you, but I did sprawl out on the picnic table seat for a while. Riding that ride so much wound up making the kid happy, though, so it made the memory of the last fair he and his sister ever went to a good one. His sister was killed in a car crash a few months later. Since the story this was based on had a sad ending, I wasn't going to throw that at you all. There must be a balance, after all. Alright, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell, that way you can catch the next video as soon as it comes out. And check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Phantasmal Poppy. Thank you. Good night. And see you all real soon.